Hi folks, Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about social trust and high levels of social trust, or hitherto at least high levels of social trust in the West, and low trust societies by comparison. And I'm talking particularly about social trust amongst ourselves, but also trust in the institutions such as the rule of law and so on, independence of courts and the like. Now, we've seen huge convulsions in effect over the last 25 years. Now, in low trust societies, it's very difficult if you want to reorder or have a revolution, if you want to reorder a low trust society, you can't go to its institutions because nobody trusts them anyway. So you can't go to somewhere where the people have higher levels of faith and trust, which may be in their church, for example, or other things. But those sort of facilities don't exist. There simply isn't the trust to begin with. So you can't turn the institutions that are there against the people because they don't trust them anyway. So really, armed revolution is the only thing that if you want to have a reorder society, that's about the only option you have. Now, in high trust societies, needless to say, you can use the political system, lobby your local politicians. They enact laws. They represent the people after all, and so that huge changes can occur, maybe over a longer space of time, but huge changes can occur through the democratic process, using the institutions that the people trust and believe in. And just to illustrate that point, if you look at say Britain in 1830, where less than 10% of the people had the vote, or around 10% had the vote, and it was tied very much to how much money you had, property ownership, those sorts of things, to just 50 years later in the 1880s, where close to 80%, I guess if you look at the total number of people over the age of 18, for example, it would have been about 65% had the vote. Bear in mind that the voting age was 23, and those sorts of things, and it was primarily men, and a smaller proportion of women, and so on. But that was a huge change. That the amount of people who got the vote went from less than 10% to 2 out of every 3. This was a huge change, and it was all achieved through the democratic process. Not that there weren't ticklish moments when mobs turned out, that sort of stuff. Remember, the Industrial Revolution was underway. There was a lot of movements of people and other forms of social changes and unrest that came from that. But that's all achieved through the democratic process. Similarly, the writs of habeas corpus, where the government can't arbitrarily arrest people without charge and detain them endlessly. I mean, look at the January 6th situation. Effectively, that's just torn up habeas corpus. It almost doesn't exist in the United States at the moment, with Merrick Garland and the Justice Department there, in my view. So from and this is when there was minimal parliamentary representation. The voting base was very small at the time in England. During the 1600s through into the early 1700s. During that time, there were many reforms to the law that, for example, habeas corpus, that limited state power. This is when the state had pretty much all the power, but limited state power for things like arbitrary arrest and arbitrary detention. So there were many reforms to the law in many ways, all through the existing institutions. Now, for that to happen, the people needed to have a lot of trust in institutions, not simply that they exist, but in the methods of instituting change and implementing change through proper codified laws. So that was now. If you take a situation like, say, Eastern Europe, that came out of the communist system and didn't have, you know, particularly sort of sophisticated, as you would say in Britain, sophisticated legal procedures and rules and so on, even before the communists arrived, but you know, went backwards heavily. Nobody had any faith in the institutions. The communists, you know, sponsored by the Soviets in the Soviet Union, the communists ensured that all the institutions were communist controlled and just parroted the party propaganda line. So no one, as much as people just stayed quiet and sullenly went about their business. The institutions that existed simply weren't trusted. The newspapers weren't believed. The government wasn't. No one assumed that the government represented the people. Far from it. So none of the institutions were trusted, and that lack of trust has hung over even until today. The government, you know, governments in Eastern Europe need to be very clear in thought and deed and in you know, written laws that they are representing the people, and trust will very slowly and very carefully and with some timidity almost come back in. As you have the case now with, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary. You know, if the people don't want mass migration, it doesn't happen. If the people don't want LGBTQ propaganda, it doesn't happen. The government makes sure it. The government represents the wishes of the people that it serves. And that's hardly a radical position. But you'd think, looking at the mass media around the world, that Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is some radical far-right Nazi, when in fact he's nothing of the sort. He simply represents the people. And we know that the globalists now decided we represent the elite interests and we don't give a flying fuck about the people. And that's the difference in positions now. So if you do represent the interests of the people, you know, you're Hitler. And if you don't represent the interests of the people and lie and cheat and deceive them and lie some more, then you're one of the good guys. Now, that's the insanity of the world we're in. But I wanted to look at this difference, that a high trust society, the only way you can bring about the revolution you want, assuming you're the globalist, for example, the only way you can bring it about is by infiltrating the institutions that the people trust and then eroding them, subverting them, destroying them from within. And then you take away all the social trust that exists in society, and then the assumption being by the globalists that then everything will just fall into their lap and they'll just take control because of they've eroded all the trust, which creates a lack of social confidence, a lack of national self-confidence, and a tone and attitude of disillusionment that's so acute that you can just walk in and take over. And if you look at through history, various societies that have sort of pretty much collapsed. If you look at the Arabs in the Arabic Islamic peoples invading Spain in 700 AD, and with a few thousand soldiers, they captured pretty much the whole of or certainly the southern half, or southern 2/3 even of Spain. They captured it with just a few thousand soldiers, even though in theory the numbers ranged against them were far greater, and the Spanish, the hangover from the old Roman Empire, the Spanish and Visigoths who'd moved in there as well. They could have easily and roundly defeated the Arabs, but they were so disillusioned, they were so disorganized, they were so too busy bickering with each other. They'd all lost confidence in the elites and how society was being run, and nobody was prepared. Well, why should I risk my ass when these bums are doing such a useless job of running the place? The Christian Catholics were being rather harsh on the Jews and that sort of thing. So when the Arabs turned up, there was just they encountered very little and mostly very feeble resistance. the soldiers, the opposing armies that they did meet, would more likely to flee the battlefield, and actually engage in any vigorous battlefield determination. So that's the globalist sort of intent, to undermine the West to a point where just no one's willing to oppose any other form of government. Or so when the globalists say we all have to live in cubicles, you're going to own nothing and be happy, and if you misgender a transgender person, you'll get 10 years in prison. But if you murder somebody, slap on the wrist. That you just completely change everything that's of value. Eradicate Christianity, because that's a binding force for the white people. Eradicate the family, again, another binding force for white people. And of course, removing the institutions. A case, Britain is a case in point. The institutions there are so long-lasting, as in many hundreds of years, probably more long-lasting, I think, than any other place on the planet. And that continuity has created, a much higher degree of social trust you'd find elsewhere, which is why Britain is particularly being targeted for, the maximum levels of humiliation and degradation that the globalists can dream up, such as every senior politician is now black or brown, that sort of thing. That's just letting people know we're in fucking charge here, and that's it. Now, I also want to talk about civic participation in that, about personal responsibility. I may even do another video on this, but why are people in their 20s and 30s still acting like children in the West today? And there's so many people in their 20s and 30s that are still living with their parents, living in the basements, and they don't own a motor vehicle unless it's been bought for them by their parents. They don't bother getting married. They live, if they've even got work, they just live in the gig economy. They don't have permanent or longer term relationships. Everything's hookup culture, and who you get laid with this week is somebody different next week. Those type of things. So there's no one's putting down roots of continuity. Now, there's some argument that that's got nothing to do with economics. It's just that they've been radicalized in high school or something, and then that's certainly an issue, the radicalization. When I think about the teachers that I had in high school, their politics will kind of be, they're left leaning. They're members of the teachers' union, but they didn't really say much about it in class. It was quite limited, even in classes, say history or something like that, or poetry, or areas where it would open itself up to left-wing type postulations and utterances. They still were quite restrained. It was still viewed as something you just didn't do. I remember the at one high school I was at, the librarian who had come out as a lesbian and all this sort of stuff, and she came out with some and it looked like some flower power type person from the 60s. She came out with a number of ill-advised leftist utterances, but that was at it, and we thought that was quite funny, particularly in senior high school. We thought she was a bit of a joke, but it's so radicalized through school. But the word, a lot of people now are saying, well, it's got nothing to do with economics. That's a conservative right wing sort of issue, that it's economic, and it's got nothing to do with that. It's the culture war, and I do agree, by the way, the culture war is a big issue. Where you've got governments busily, if not aggressively, taking down all statues of white people, then you've got a culture war on your hands. There's no debating that. But is economics a part of it, and the economics of lifestyle as well? So the average age that people, when I left school, the average age of people who left school and started work was 16 back in the day. And it's not that long ago, for goodness sakes. So we're talking not quite 40 years ago, but so 16 was the time they left school. Now it's like, if you add in college and so on, it's 24. Not simply because people are doing 6 years of college necessarily, but they may be changing number of courses. They may start off with a course that has some rigor to it, and then switch to some sociology course that has no rigor, and so that's they're not leaving college till they're 24. Or alternatively, they may do a year or two and decide, well, it's just tough. I'll go and lie on a beach for a couple of years and then come back to it later. And you're only young once, and da da da. So it's now 24 until people ostensibly are coming out in the workforce. So and even then, with the gig economy, some of the 24-year-old, like the kids of people I know, they maybe do a couple of nights delivering pizzas. Then they may do a couple of half a day at some other takeout food shop, and then when work a day at a cafe on the week, this sort of thing. So they may have 3 or 4 just gig economy type jobs, which are very unstable. Their employers can just they turn up for work, or 5 minutes before they're meant to turn up, they get a phone call saying, no, we don't need you today, that type of thing. So it's very unstable. Their income can vary by 50% week to week. It's that you can't plan around that. You can't take a mortgage or take on responsibilities for feeding a family or something when you've got that level of uncertainty. So these are feeding into this thing of where, what future do I have to look forward to? What is the point or purpose of my life? What am I doing? Why am I here? Why am I getting out of bed in the morning? All these sorts of things. Not that they haven't been questions that have been asked, through the whole human existence, but they're on a relative basis. From 40 years ago, people the incomes were such that you could if you had a sort of even a working job in the factory, and your partner worked in some other sort of similar level job, you had enough income there to buy a house, have a family, and that was your future. That you had a stake in society, you had a stake in the future of society through your children. You had people that are depending on you, that required you to be responsible and a responsible adult. Bring home the bacon and all that sort of thing. And that creates people who have to behave like adults in a much younger age. And it wasn't unusual when again, I was a kid. It wasn't unusual to see 17, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds with children. I remember it. I'd probably been year 11, high school, something like that, and this girl who'd finished year 12, and she'd got married straight out of high school. Again, not that unusual back in the day. It wasn't commonplace, but not unusual at the same time. And she came to school with a baby and was showing it off, and all the girls were oohing and cooing and all that sort of thing. Now, I suppose in the areas where the projects and so on, you may find that sort of thing, but it wasn't viewed as unusual that white girls from middle class families would get married young, straight out of high school, and have children straight away. And it was interesting. Her husband, who I had actually met before, just trying to think where, but I met, and how grown up and adult he seemed, even though he was only, say, 2 years older, 3 years older max than me at the time. He seemed so grown up and so serious and so sensible and so practical in ways that as a year 11 high school student, I didn't fully come to understand or come to grips with. So there's clearly a difference in the responsibilities people take on and how soon they have to be adults. And when you have a stake in society that way, you are concerned about the direction society is going in terms of its practical realities, not in terms of how many transgender bathrooms there might be. Now, this has all changed so that very few people now, younger people coming through, very few of them are taking on responsibilities at a young age. Now, I remember talking to sort of union radicals when I was a young guy, guys who were in their 50s, and they were radical trade unionists and radical communist Marxists and revolutionaries and so on. They were a pretty sort of wild-eyed bunch, I thought. And but something that struck me at the time was how childish they were. they lived in a fantasy world of ideology rather than a world of practical reality. And even again, people in their 50s, and me in, say, in my early 20s or something like that, I would look at these people who were twice my age, and they would come across to me even then as children, yes, silly children at that. And there's vastly more of those people around, and a much greater number of people even today into their 50s that have that childish, so that same childish attitude. It's not unusual to be talking to the wife of a wealthy captain of industry, whose house is adorned with posters of Nelson Mandela and Gandhi and fucking Martin Luther King and so on. You go, wow, like they're living some fantasy days. It's like they've never stopped being undergraduates in the sociology course at some radicalized university. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention was that nearly all the kids that I knew at school had part-time jobs, like on weekends or something like that. Now, it could be working, helping the local lawnmower guy. It could be working at the local grocery store or the local chain takeout food store, McDonald's, that sort of thing. And these companies had a lot of systems and procedures, and this is how you do it, and this is how you approach this and that, and so on. And it was a great place to learn discipline of having to turn up for time, taking responsibility, and silly things like, hey, Billy Bob, it's your responsibility to make sure we flip 50 burgers in the next hour, and that sort of thing, that was treated as serious. And if you don't do it, you're letting down your colleagues and fellow workers and that sort of thing. And that certainly, in me at least, it instilled a sense of responsibility and well, not necessarily purpose. I mean, it was a job while I was still at school, but it's also put money in my pocket. It gave me to appreciate money and the nature of responsibility generally. Now that's completely changed. That doesn't happen anywhere near the scale that it previously did. I just don't see the amount of school kids, college kids anymore, in that it's nearly all brown and black people doing those sort of work now, or all of whom hate white people and white society. So that's not much use. But also, and I've certainly noticed in the people that we hire and interview for some of the more basic jobs, like working on trade show stands, things like that, and they're mostly girls who apply, and every fucking one of them has only ever worked for an NGO, whether as an intern or as a volunteer or as a paid employee. So you're looking at 80% plus of the Western female population has not only been radicalized through school and college, but they've been double, triple, uber radicalized through the NGO system, something that didn't even exist 25 years ago. So you've got these highly radicalized people, particularly young women, highly radicalized people that believe Western society is evil and bad, and any alternative, no matter what it is, any alternative, you'll own nothing and be happy, live in a cubicle. Well, that's fine, because that'll mean equality for black lesbians. Oh, that'll mean equality for trans. And they've been trained to believe that society is so bad, Western society, trained to believe it, and they sucker for it. Low IQ people, they sucker for it. Believe that Western society is so bad that any alternative is an improvement, no matter what the collateral damage is. Anything is better than what we have now, and that means that the amount of people that are prepared to say, well, hold on a relative basis, Western society is actually pretty good. Well, the reason I can't afford a house now, and I've got no future in the world, in the society, I mean, that's been caused by the globalists, the very people that are manipulating me into believing that my society is bad. Why is it my parents could afford to buy a house from a job at the factory, whereas I work 80 hours a week and I can't even afford to pay rent, or that sort of thing? Why aren't those questions being asked? And it shows you the extent to the radicalization is so tight and so narrowly focused, and yet the globalists have been able to keep, particularly the young women, but others as well, the gays and all that sort of, keep them on a narrow track that the West is evil and bad, when in reality it's been their future of these people who think the West is so bad, their future's been taken away from them economically and socially has been taken away from them by the globalists that have allowed the mass migration, not allowed, encouraged it, fostered it, paid for it, the mass migration, so that how the price of rents and houses have increased at three times the rate of wages, making it unaffordable for anything other than a small amount of the population. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. I thank you for listening.